Right now, somewhere in the world, a human embryo is growing a tail. Not a metaphorical one. An actual physical tail, complete with its own set of tiny vertebrae, sticking out from the base of the spine like something straight out of a monster movie. And here's the part that should really mess with you. Every single human embryo does this. Yours did too. Mine did too. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that tail disappears before you're even born, and why the scientific answer to that mystery only got solved a few years ago thanks to one exhausted graduate student, a broken jar, and a seriously unlucky cut on his finger. Let's start with the weird part nobody tells you in biology class. Around 4 to 5 weeks into human development, embryos grow what's technically called a tail bud, a genuine tail structure with somewhere between 10 and 12 vertebrae. For a brief window, human embryos look startlingly similar to embryos of other tailed animals: fish, mice, even other primates. Then, over the following weeks, that tail gets reabsorbed back into the body, its cells repurposed, its length shrinking down until all that's left is a small cluster of fused vertebrae at the base of your spine. You know it today as the coccyx. Or if you've ever fallen hard on your backside, you know it as that one bone that ruins your whole week. Every human alive today is walking around with the leftover architecture of a tail we simply never finished building. Which raises the obvious question. Why does the tail get switched off partway through development? And more importantly, why did our ancestors lose it in the first place? For a long time, the explanations people offered were mostly educated guesswork dressed up as science. Maybe tails just became less necessary as body size increased. Maybe they were an energy drain not worth carrying around anymore. These ideas weren't unreasonable, but none of them were actually testable in any rigorous way, and none of them explained the specific genetic mechanism that made tail loss happen in the first place. You can theorize about why evolution might favor something all day long, but without finding the actual molecular switch involved, you're really just telling an educated story, not proving one. Here's where we need to zoom out. Almost every vertebrate on the planet has a tail. Fish have them, reptiles have them. The vast majority of mammals have them, including most primates. Monkeys swing through trees with long, dramatic tails trailing behind them, sometimes even using them like a functional extra limb. New World monkeys in Central and South America take that concept to an extreme, evolving prehensile tails strong and dexterous enough to grip branches and support their entire body weight, essentially turning the tail into a fifth hand. And then you get to the apes. Gibbons, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and us. Not a single tail among any of them. Somewhere around 25 million years ago, the common ancestor of all apes lost its tail completely, and every single descendant species inherited that same tailless body plan. That's a strange thing to happen to an entire branch of the primate family tree, and for decades, scientists genuinely had no idea what caused it at a genetic level. They could see the pattern in the fossil record. They just couldn't explain the actual biological switch that flipped. It's worth pausing on just how useful tails actually are for the animals that kept them, because losing one wasn't some obviously smart upgrade. Old World monkeys use their tails constantly for balance, sprinting along branches, leaping between trees, correcting their posture mid-air the way a tightrope walker uses a balance pole. New World monkeys took things even further, some species evolving tails strong enough to hang their entire body weight from a branch while both hands stay free to eat, groom, or grab a snack from a neighboring tree. In a lot of ways, a tail is a phenomenally efficient piece of biological engineering, which makes it even stranger that an entire lineage of primates just walked away from that advantage entirely. That mystery sat mostly unsolved for a surprisingly long time, until an accident in a New York apartment cracked it wide open. In 2019, a graduate student named Bo Xia was cleaning up his kitchen when he cut his finger on a piece of broken glass. Nothing dramatic, just an annoying trip to the emergency room, and a handful of stitches. But sitting in that waiting room, nursing his hand and presumably bored out of his mind, Xia started thinking about scar tissue, about how differently various animals regenerate damaged body parts, and about how some species can even regrow entire limbs while humans are stuck forming scars instead. That train of thought eventually spiraled into a much bigger question about lost body parts in general. And somewhere down that rabbit hole, he landed squarely on the tail. It's a genuinely wonderful example of how scientific discovery actually works sometimes, which is to say, not through some grand planned research proposal, but through a bored, mildly injured person staring at a waiting room wall, chasing one curious thought to its logical extreme. Sia reportedly went home that same night and started reading everything he could find about tail loss in primates, which is either the most productive reaction to a minor injury in scientific history, or a sign that graduate school does strange things to a person's relationship with free time. Possibly both. Here's the twist that turned an ER visit into a genuine scientific breakthrough. Jia, working alongside researchers including Itai Yanai at NYU, started digging into a gene called TBXT, a gene long known to play a critical role in tail development across vertebrates. When they compared the TBXT gene across tailed primates and tailless apes, they found something unexpected sitting inside it. A small chunk of extra genetic material, called an ALU element, had inserted itself into the gene at some point in ape evolutionary history. ALU elements are sometimes nicknamed jumping genes because they're small mobile pieces of DNA capable of copying themselves and inserting into new locations throughout the genome, often without causing any noticeable effect at all. In fact, the human genome is absolutely packed with these things. Over 1 million copies scattered throughout our DNA, the overwhelming majority of them just sitting there quietly, doing essentially nothing of consequence. Except this time, it did cause an effect. A big one. That ALU insertion sat right in a spot that interfered with how the gene gets processed, triggering something called alternative splicing. In simple terms, the cell's machinery started reading and assembling the gene's instructions slightly differently, producing a shortened, altered version of the TBXT protein. And that altered version appears to disrupt tail formation during embryonic development. Naturally, the researchers didn't just want a compelling story sitting in a genome comparison. They wanted proof, the kind that actually holds up under scrutiny rather than just sounding convincing in a research meeting. So they took this specific genetic change and engineered it directly into mice. And the mice grew little to no tails. Let that sink in for a second. A single, specific genetic tweak, isolated by researchers chasing a hunch that started with a kitchen accident, was enough to dramatically shorten or completely eliminate tails in laboratory mice. That's about as close to solving a 25-million-year-old evolutionary mystery as modern genetics gets. But here's the twist inside the twist. And honestly, this is the part that makes the whole story so much darker and more interesting than a simple, "we found the tail gene" headline. The mice with this engineered mutation didn't just lose their tails cleanly. Some of them also developed neural tube defects, the same broad category of birth defect responsible for conditions like spina bifida in humans, where the spinal column doesn't close properly during development. In other words, the mutation that likely helped our ancestors lose their tails may have come bundled with a real biological cost. Not a clean upgrade, a trade-off. And this isn't just an abstract footnote about ancient ape evolution either. Neural tube defects are still a real, ongoing concern in human pregnancies today, affecting a meaningful number of births worldwide every single year, which is exactly why doctors emphasize folate intake so heavily during pregnancy in the first place. It's genuinely strange to consider that a small genetic scar left over from a 25-million-year-old mutation might still, in some roundabout evolutionary sense, be tangled up with a modern medical concern that expecting parents are warned about at every prenatal appointment. Think about what that implies. Somewhere around 25 million years ago, a genetic change swept through the ancestral ape population, a change that removed the tail but simultaneously nudged up the risk of a serious developmental defect. And it stuck around anyway. It spread through the entire lineage, becoming permanent in every ape species that came after, humans absolutely included. Which means whatever advantage came with losing the tail must have been significant enough to outweigh that increased risk generation after generation for millions of years. So what was that advantage? This is where the story shifts from pure genetics into behavior and locomotion, and honestly, it makes a lot of sense once you picture it. Around the time apes lost their tails, their movement style was shifting dramatically. Monkeys tend to move quadrupedally along the tops of branches, using a long tail as a counterbalance while running and leaping. Apes, on the other hand, increasingly relied on a completely different strategy called suspensory locomotion, essentially swinging below branches using their arms, a style you can still watch gibbons perform today with genuinely alarming speed and precision. A balancing tail becomes a lot less useful when you're hanging beneath a branch instead of running along the top of one. In fact, a long trailing tail might have actively gotten in the way, a dangling liability rather than a helpful counterweight. Losing it may have streamlined this new style of movement, freeing up energy and reducing unnecessary weight for a body plan that was rapidly specializing toward upper body strength and shoulder mobility instead of tail-based balance. Watch footage of a gibbon flying arm over arm through a rainforest canopy sometime, and it becomes fairly obvious pretty quickly that a long dangling tail would be less of a helpful accessory and more of an unfortunate way to get tangled in a branch mid-swing. And this shift in locomotion didn't just shape how apes moved through trees. Many researchers believe it laid essential groundwork for what came later in the hominin lineage, increasingly upright posture and eventually full bipedalism. A body already restructured around vertical climbing and arm-supported movement, rather than four-legged running with a counterbalancing tail, may have been considerably better positioned to eventually stand up and walk on two legs. So, in a strange, roundabout way, that ancient genetic accident, one tiny piece of jumping DNA landing in exactly the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right spot inside a single gene, may have quietly set the stage for the entire trajectory of human evolution that followed. No tail meant a different way of moving. A different way of moving eventually meant walking upright. And walking upright meant hands were free for absolutely everything that came next. Tool use, complex manipulation, eventually building entire civilizations, all resting on a foundation that started with losing something as seemingly minor as a tail. There's one more strange detail worth mentioning before we wrap up. Every so often, medical literature documents extremely rare human cases where a baby is born with what doctors call a vestigial human tail, a small soft tissue protrusion at the base of the spine without actual vertebrae inside it. These cases are exceptionally uncommon and typically resolve with straightforward surgical removal, but they're a genuinely striking reminder that the ancient biological instructions for building a tail haven't fully vanished from our genome. They're still tucked away in there, mostly silent, occasionally, very rarely, slipping past the usual developmental override. It's a bit like discovering your house still technically has the wiring for an appliance nobody in the family has used for several generations, quietly dormant behind the walls, waiting for a circumstance that almost never comes. So the next time you catch yourself absent-mindedly rubbing your tailbone after sitting too long on a hard chair, remember what you're actually touching. Not some random leftover bone with no story behind it, but the final remnant of a body part your ancestors relied on for millions of years, deliberately switched off by one small, accidental genetic insertion that happened to arrive with a hidden cost attached and turned out to be worth it anyway. If this genuinely surprised you, drop a single word in the comments. Tailbone. I want to know if you'll ever look at your own. Coccyx the same way again after learning it's basically an unfinished construction project abandoned 25 million years ago. And if stories like this, where one tiny accident of biology quietly reshapes the entire future of a species, are your thing, there's a lot more buried inside our genome just waiting to be uncovered. Because sometimes the difference between the body you have and the body your ancestors had comes down to something as small as a single piece of DNA landing in exactly the wrong place at exactly the right evolutionary moment. It's honestly a little humbling when you think about it. 25 million years of ape evolution, an entire family tree stretching from gibbons to gorillas to us, quietly traces back to one jumping gene that happened to land inside one particular spot in one particular ancestor's DNA. No grand plan, no dramatic event. Just a small molecular accident that stuck around long enough to become permanent, carried forward silently through millions of generations, until it eventually became something you could actually go looking for, cut your finger and stumble into discovering almost by accident all over again.